Okay, I know the title is bold, but first of all, just let me say this isn't the same Ubisoft studio who makes Assassin's Creed. I know these days a lot of people are starting to get a little bored of those. This is Ubisoft Montpellier, who make a very different type of game entirely. You might not know many of their small lineup of games, maybe you know Beyond Good and Evil, and they did make a Ghost Recon game once upon a time. Perhaps you might know them as the studio responsible for the creation of the Raving Rabbids, but actually the game that Ubisoft Montpellier is probably most well known for is Rayman Legends, which was very, very well received. So this studio does know its 2D platformers. And it seems that when they turn their attention to Metroidvanias, they also know their stuff. This game isn't quite perfect, but I had such a good time stepping into the shoes of Sargon the Immortal. Welcome to my review for Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. So prior to this, I don't really have a lot of experience with Prince of Persia. I played a little bit of the colourful one that came out on the Xbox 360, and I do still have my copy of that, but I didn't get very far, and I didn't actually play the other games at all. So if, like me, you're basically new to this series, don't worry, you can play this one without having any knowledge of the previous entries. I'm not going to do any spoilers for this video. I will keep the footage to only show the first couple of hours of the game. If you've played a Metroidvania, then you know a lot of what to expect out of this game, but out of all of the Metroidvanias I've played before, this one has the heaviest focus on story. Right from the start, you're thrown straight in, and I will say the opening cutscene had me hooked straight away. You play as Sargon, an immortal of Persia, and the game starts with the immortals defending Persia from invasion, but this quickly escalates as you undertake a rescue mission for Prince Hassan, who's been kidnapped and forced up the mysterious Mount Kaf. I won't give any more details on the story, but I will say that I found this story and these characters really awesome. I had an amazing time working my way through this narrative and all of its twists and turns and getting to know these great characters. Everything about this game just oozes cool. Sargon is cool, the rest of the immortals are cool, the art style is really cool. You've been seeing some footage on the screen so you can judge for yourself, but this game is just stylish. It kind of reminds me of something like Persona 5. It's got that really distinct look, which I think is great. Some of the locations as well look absolutely amazing. When you're watching some of the cutscenes, I think the way they're framed and animated, it really feels like they might have taken some inspiration from like an anime show, which was a real surprise when I first saw that, but definitely a good one. I think it does add something here. So I really do like the story and presentation of this game, but I do have just one or two little niggles. One of these is that while the game is voice acted, which I really appreciate, some of the dialogue, the way it's written, particularly at the start of the game, it just feels a bit wooden, a bit unnatural, and not sort of how the characters would actually talk. The game also has these beautiful character paintings that pop up when they're talking, and sometimes portraits pop up either on the left side of the screen or the right side. And one character, Artaban, he's got a mask on one side of his face, and you can tell that they must mirror the portraits depending on which side they put them on, because the mask is sometimes on the wrong side of his face. It's not a huge issue, but it did throw me a little bit at first. So there are a lot of positives when it comes to the story and presentation of this game, but really none of that matters if the gameplay itself is boring, right? Well, as a Metroidvania type of game, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown is all in 2D, and it has a mix of both combat and platforming. You start off quite weak and with a limited tool set, but as the game progresses you unlock new powers and upgrades. These give you access to new areas of the map, and along the way you fight plenty of bosses. Now, one of the things I don't like in Metroidvanias is that I think the combat can often feel slow and weak at first, and sometimes it can take me a little while to get into them because of this, but then by the end of the game you turn into this absolute hero with really slick moves and amazing skills. Now in The Lost Crown, I would argue that you already start off feeling like a complete badass with some really slick moves. The basic combat of this game, the sword fighting, feels really good. You've got your normal combos, but you also have air attacks, launching attacks, sliding attacks, and even from the very start you can pull off some really cool chains that keep your enemies on the back foot. There's a few defensive options as well. The slide acts as a dodge, but it also lets you get behind your enemy ready to attack again. And there is a parry button too, so those with good timing can avoid damage and stagger enemies. And the parry is great because it also leads to a mechanic called vengeful counters. Sometimes enemies have a yellow glint as they attack, and if you're successful with your timing, the parry turns into an execution, which feels really cool to pull off. and the animation for these always looks really good as well. Finally, you've got a set of special attacks. These are called Athra Surges, and some gear in the form of amulets. The Athra Surges build up with a bar, and they unleash some really powerful moves. There are a number to choose from that you find through the world, and you can pick two. You can have two ready to go at any time. One of these, I tend to like sticking with one that gives you a healing zone. You get that at the start, but there are plenty of other offensive options as well so that you can swap out. Now, amulets give you different passive upgrades, so maybe you get a health boost, or maybe you get half your health back the first time that you die, or maybe you do more damage in the air. There really are a lot of these, and you can find more and more slots as well throughout the game, so there's plenty of opportunity to tailor the upgrades towards your playstyle and make you more powerful in the way that you want to play. Finally, on combat, I wanted to give special mention to the bosses. So in my opinion, Metroidvanias live and die by their boss fights, and I think the Lost Crown has a really excellent set of bosses to take on. I won't show any of the later bosses, but these can be like genuinely hard. I played on the default difficulty, and there were some boss fights that I had to do plenty of times over before I finally cracked them. This might sound like a negative, but I never really felt too frustrated. So first of all, the designs were really cool in general, and then the range of abilities that these bosses used, it keeps the fights really interesting. They've got lots of different things that you have to figure out, and the boss fights always felt fair. Often I would die, but I'd get a little closer to whittling their health to zero, and I could feel myself improving, and it felt really rewarding when you started to figure out their mechanics. So maybe you'd finally land a vengeful parry, and that would take off a chunk of health, and maybe you've been struggling with that for the last few attempts, or maybe you'd finally figure out how to combine your movement abilities to completely avoid damage from one of the boss's signature attacks. And moments like these make you feel how far you've come playing this game, and so, you know, even when you did die, if you were starting to pull off some of these moves, it never felt too frustrating. Thirdly, the way that the respawn points work for bosses, I think, is really friendly to players. So when you die, the game gives you two options. The first one just takes you straight back into the fight right away. It does play the cutscenes again, but these can be skipped, and it's much better in my opinion than having to sort of run back from somewhere else to get back to the boss fight, so great choice here. The second option is to respawn at one of the safe zones, and so if you are struggling with a boss, you always have the option to take a break from fighting the boss to go and do something else, maybe build up some more currency and purchase an upgrade to your gear before you then go back and try again. The boss fights were a delight to play, extremely cool, really rewarding, and again, the art style of the game comes through really well with these. Now, most of the Metroidvanias that I've played in the past are on the Metroid side of things rather than on the Castlevania side, and Metroid Dread was probably my favourite of these with how slick and smooth it felt traversing around the map. And I'm really happy to say that Prince of Persia continues and maybe even builds on that idea. Right at the start, you're given a few options, things like sliding, sprinting, wall jumping, but even these help to make the game feel good, even at the start, and by the end of the game, you've unlocked a good selection of powers that help you get around the world. The most basic of these is just a double jump, but they get pretty exciting later on, and when you do unlock a new traversal ability, the very next zone makes a lot of use of whatever it is that you've just unlocked and you're now able to do, and so it almost acts like a tutorial to help you understand your new power better, but at the same time it doesn't feel too handholdy. I think they've got that balance right, and I really like how they build those levels. Now, all of these movement options and powers, they come together into some of the most fun that I've had with platforming puzzles and challenges in quite a long time. They start off with just like a bunch of wall jumps to try and get somewhere higher, but as you unlock more and more of the traversal abilities, they expand, they get more complicated, they get much more challenging. And I will say they can get really quite hard. And some of them are just optional, they're hiding hidden collectibles, but some of them are baked right into the main route that you have to take to advance the game, so there's no option to skip some of these. There were times when, like bosses, it took me quite a few retries before I could complete them, but luckily if you fall to your death, it only actually takes a little bit of health off and it just drops you back onto the platform that you fell off from. Even so though, they can be really challenging. The flip side of this is that they're then really rewarding when you beat them. I'm going to show a quick clip now of one of these later platforming sections. Now, be warned, this doesn't have any spoilers for the story, but it does show, you know, later powers that you might not have seen before if you haven't been keeping up with the trailers. It's only about 30 seconds, so skip ahead if you want to, but just to warn you. As you can imagine, I was really pleased when I finally beat that. Now, at this point in the video, I'd like to talk about graphics and performance. So I played the game on the Nintendo Switch, and I'm really pleased to say that when you're zipping around, traversing the map, fighting normal enemies or these awesome bosses, the frame rate is nice and smooth. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that it's running at 60 FPS both in handheld and also in docked. The only weird thing is that while the gameplay runs really well here, there are some unusual drops in frame rates during cutscenes, and it's not just occasional, it feels like every cutscene you are getting some drops in frame rate. Now, it didn't break the game for me, but it definitely felt like a blemish on what was otherwise a great experience playing this game. Because I enjoyed the story so much, I was often really interested in these cutscenes, and so it felt like a bit of a shame that they would often be marred with these sort of weird laggy frame rates. Another thing to note on performance is that while there's not many long loading times, most of the time you walk into a new area and it only takes a couple of seconds, but fast traveling does seem to take a fair bit longer. It's not like other Switch games that I've seen, so like Hogwarts Legacy for example has really long loading times. It's not quite that long, but it just was longer than I expected. Resolution wise, the game seems to sit pretty stably. I didn't notice any variance in the resolution or any model edges that suddenly seemed very pixelated. The textures seem to have maybe just a tiny bit less detail than on one of the more powerful consoles, but the developers have chosen an art style here that seems to run really well on all consoles without too many sacrifices. Now, the final thing I'll touch on is the length of the game. I finished my playthrough in a little over 12 hours, maybe 13, but this doesn't really include any of the additional content, so I didn't go out of my way to find collectibles, and at first I only went through the main storyline. I only did a very small amount of side quests. I'm going back to do those later. And by the way, it was a nice surprise to have, side quests in a game like this. You can probably add on a few hours for those side quests, so I think probably the game is about 15 hours in total, and of course your time will vary depending on how many attempts it takes you to do some of the boss fights and how good you are at figuring out where it is to go next. So there were definitely a few points for me where I had to backtrack because I'd gone to the place where you were supposed to go and I'd looked around, but I'd completely missed the clue for what to do next. So I'd left the area, then ended up going back again to proceed. So just make sure that you're checking everywhere thoroughly. So should you buy Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown? Well, I think it's an absolutely amazing step in the Metroidvania genre. I really like the story. The focus on that was a real positive for me. The characters were great, the combat was great, and the boss fights were really fun and rewarding. It runs really well on Switch, but does have that weird exception of the cutscenes lagging graphically, and it's also not the price of a full next-gen game either. You can pick it up for about £45 or $50, so if you like Metroidvanias, I think you'll really enjoy this brand new entry into the Prince of Persia series. Let me know down in the comments if you're interested in this game. Maybe you've been playing it already, and if that's so, let me know what you think. I'd be really interested to find out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.